Thank you for joining us for the 19th Annual Town History Series at the Patent Free Library. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I'm the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian in the Saginaw History and Genealogy Room at the Patent Free Library. The library is so happy that you could join us on this very chilly day. Thank you for braving the cold to be with us, and thank you for those on Zoom for being with us that way too. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have just a few important bits of information to share. I would like to thank all of the historical societies of our member towns for selecting our fabulous speakers and helping to get the word out. Thank you to Peter Goodwin, former manager of the History Room and founder of the Town History Series. Thank you also to Bath Historical Society, not only for today's talk, but for generously offering to professionally film each of the program in this year's series. If you're with us in person today, please note that the speaker is being filmed by a camera at the back of the room, so just be cautious if you need to walk by. This recording will be available in our collection on DVD and will be available for checkout. The Zoom recording of today's program will be available on our YouTube page as early as next week. Finally, thank you to our audience, especially today. Thank you for building momentum for this series year after year and for showing up both today in person and on Zoom. This is our first year back in person since 2020 and our first series that we're hosting hybrid. So thank you in advance for your patience while we navigate our hybrid programs because they're all very different. They all have their own challenges. If you're joining us on Zoom, please note that this is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot unmute or turn on your camera, but you can use the chat and the Q&A feature. Once the program begins, we will be screen sharing the visuals. So if you can't see the screen well right now, don't worry. And we also will be sharing some video. So please bear with us because video doesn't always come across fabulously on Zoom. But I believe the video is also in our collection, so you can check it out. At any point during the talk, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature and we'll facilitate that Q&A at the end of the talk. And if you need to communicate with library staff about technical issues, you can also use the chat feature. This year's Town History Series is dedicated to Sheila Spear. Sheila volunteered for the History Room, indexing obituaries for our memory database, and she was the first town administrator of Aroostook until her retirement in 2022. At last year's Town History Series, Sheila represented Aroostook and presented Gift or Purchase, Relation to the Land, Aroostook 1717. Sheila passed away this fall and is greatly missed by her community. Our speaker today represents Bath Historical Society. I'm so pleased to welcome Joe Minott. Joe is a lifelong Bath resident and he has been studying local history for 50 years. If you know Joe, which I'm sure many of you do, you know that Joe is someone who loves to share local history. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Mary Kate. And I want to thank Tim Richter, my technical guru over here, that put the slide presentation together. I'm not a speaker. I'm behind the scenes person, and I'm definitely not a college professor. So the talk is not going to sound like that at all. So I chose Oak Grove Cemetery because it just seemed to be a natural fit for me this year. I've been putting out the calendar for the Historical Society for many years. And back to Oak Grove Cemetery. My first association with Oak Grove goes back 60 years. I would go there with my father to plant and tend the memorial flowers at our family lots. Throughout my life, I've studied Bath history and for years obtained information from the cemetery office. The last several years, I volunteered there in the office. One day, a call came into the office with a request for a cemetery tour for the Fisher Mitchell 5th grade history club. Tours have been made up in the past, and one of them was the newest one that is on the top here was partially funded by the Davenport Trust Fund. And that was back in 2001. So I stepped up to the plate and decided that I'd do the tour for Meg Barker and her group. And being a very visual person, instead of just looking at names on memorials, I thought that I would do a visual history tour. So these are basically two of the yard sale signs that we had made up for the tour. And what my intention was is to share with the students in the tour things that they could relate to around Bath. Now, on the top, we know the children's home. We know where that is, and almost everybody drives by it if they live down the south end. So that's why I've been, that was like part of the tour. And down below, everybody has seen the outdoor statue sculpture of the Wyoming down at the Maritime Museum. And to the left is Captain Sam Percy of Percy and Small Shipyard, and the woman up at the right corner is Sarah Sampson, and she had a lot to do during the Civil War. She was a Civil War nurse and was down in Washington and had a lot of talks with Abraham Lincoln, and she was the founder of the children's home, one of the founders, and that was founded in 1866 and lasted until 1996. The building's still there, but it's a private home now with apartments. So since I had done all the research on for the cemetery tour, I thought that I'd use that information and put out a calendar on it. So this year's calendar is all about the cemetery. And we have plenty of those for sale today. When the land was purchased by the city, there were already burials on the land itself. And this is the earliest stone marker of Mary Sewell, and she died in 1777, as you can see. And as you, right here, we have a representation of markers through the years. The first ones in the front are made out of slate. And then it was fashionable to have marble markers, which is in the white. And then the black marker in the back is made out of granite, which is used today. Now we have quite an unusual one here, and this is a cast zinc stone. I believe there's only one in Oak Grove Cemetery. There may be others, but this is the one that I know of. And it's unique to this, there's only one in this cemetery, but there are many around the country and throughout the state of Maine. October of 1872, the city purchased the first piece of land from Charles Sewell. An Oak Cemetery was shown on an 1850 map, and we think that's where the earliest burials are. And then later on, in 1908, William S. Sewell Farm was added to the land, which was to the land adjacent to the cemetery. So today Oak Grove Cemetery has over 100 acres. And as with any research, everything, can be interpreted in different ways. And the way I have it written up in the calendar that there's another purchase of land, but since research from that time is that piece of land was not suitable for burials, but it's listed in the calendar. So, that's how life is. The word cemetery was Googled, and what came up was the Greek meaning, a place of sleep, and I really like that. The city hired John H. Ramsey as a superintendent in 1883. I haven't found an image of him, so I've represented him and his family this way, with his wife Martha and children Fred and Ada. The children's marker exhibits the craft of the stone cutter at its best: tree stump, hat, baby shoes, and a ribbon. Ramsey was superintendent from 1897 till 1897 when he died. His brother Robert T. Ramsey took over until 1901. Under the care of John Ramsey, who came to Bath from Portland, where his father was the superintendent of Evergreen Cemetery, John began to design the cemetery as a park and garden cemetery, with the summer house, walkways, trees and garden plantings, and ponds with bridges, and it was meant for the families to come to recreate for the day, not like, back then it was much different. So all that is left is the stone stairs going up to the summer house, basically. But I will say that the wildlife abounds around the lakes with turtle, geese, and other birds. And one day when I was out there taking pictures for this show, there was a woodpecker up there, and I was really liking that. Many people visit the cemetery for many reasons today. This is the North Pond, and what you're seeing is one of the islands that are planted with flowers that they had raised in one of the greenhouses that the city had. And in the outer circle is caladium. The next would be cardinal. The third row in would be canis, and then the center row would be ricini, and those grow from 6 feet to 20 feet tall. And the island itself is a circumference of 200 feet. Like I said, the cemetery did have its own greenhouse at one time to support the plantings, but it did burn down. And then I read last night that they had rebuilt it. In 1895, John Ramsey established the Kennebec Nurseries, and that's next door to Maple Grove Cemetery. Later, it was called Kennebec Greenhouses. I couldn't find a good image of the office, but I know it exists. From the Sanborn maps, it shows how extensive the operation was. Mr. Paul Ohm bought the operation in the early 1900s and operated it from 1902 to 1945. And here's where it really gets good. In my family, I have there are florists in my family. And the Minotts had a florist shop, greenhouses in South Portland and later in Portland. In 1930, my grandfather, Clarence, who was known as Jack, had a greenhouse in Bangor. Mr. O hired my grandfather. That's why I am here today, because my grandfather was hired by Mr. O when they moved to Bath. Did you go by Mr. Holmes, Martha?
No.
You don't have to. I don't have much to write about Mr. Holmes, but it was more about my story, and that's how it is. It's not, it's gonna be, these things are gonna be about for different reasons. Horace Ward became superintendent in 1901 to 1947. John Ramsey and Horace Ward I've been most impressed with. Other superintendents have accomplished good works for the Bath cemeteries. During Mr. Ward's time, he brought the record keeping into the 20th century. With his efforts, he developed a card system to locate burials by name, location of burials in each lot, and a mapping system to figure out where the lots are. Right here, we have the lot of Alice Dane, and she was one of the nurses that cared for the people during the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic and died because of it. She was one of the 3 nurses that died. And the standard lot is 200 square feet, and that can hold 6 full burials. And this lot here is a double lot. And on the lower left-hand corner of the map that's where the Charles and Warren Dane lots are, as listed here. A new cemetery office was opened in the fall of 1925. A new receiving vault was built in 1946 to replace the old one built in 1856. I couldn't find old images of these, so I didn't use any. The cemetery mostly closes down for burials in the winter. That's why we have a receiving tomb. And to hold the anyhow. Now we have the whole 9 yards, the whole 9 sections. They were added as needed. The western leather section was started in night. Oh, there's your list over there. And I thought we had dates on some of those, like the Western Ranges and like that. But the Western Ranges, which is in the center, were like the first sections of the cemetery that were developed, and then the Eastern Ranges. And then in 1919, the lettered section, which is in the light teal blue. And the south side was in 1937. And I'm not sure about when Oak Grove North was developed. And then the annex came, and no, it wasn't, all those sections in those sections weren't developed at the same time. It was as time went on, because L West is one of the last sections, and 7 South, which is the big section on the lower part of it, is like one of the last ones. So here is the early images of the lettered section. Now, most of the history part has been told. It seems like I'm out of order somehow. Here are a few of the organizational memorials, lots that are in the cemetery. One being, as you can read, the Bath Fireman's Memorial, American Legion, and the Grand Army of the Republic. And the cannon from the Grand Army of the Republic came from the Fort Popham. Memorial Day is a big day at Oak Grove Cemetery, and we put out a lot of flags, and we do it because we like to. Memorial Day was first celebrated May 18th, 1866, to remember the Civil War veterans. Back then it was called Decoration Day, now celebrated on May 30th. A list is still being developed and to include all veterans of all wars long ago and from today. Okay, now here's where the history part is. We'll stop. And so we have the Hyde family mausoleum, which is one of 4 mausoleums within the cemetery. The other ones being Drake, Morse, and then there's a double mausoleum called under the family names of Kimball and Shaw. So right now I'm going to hand this over to Tim Richter, and he's going to give you a little talk because he knows more about Civil War people than I do.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out. So there's several people in the Hyde Mausoleum, obviously, but the most important, the most famous is certainly our local Civil War hero, Thomas W. Hyde, who Thomas Hyde was, like many, a well-educated local and went off to serve in the Civil War. Things were very different then. It was honorable to join the army or the military and go off to West Point, although Hyde was not a West Pointer. He had worked his way into getting a commission, and as an officer was with the 7th Maine Volunteer Infantry at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. He, as is noted there, earned the Medal of Honor in 1891 for the actions at Antietam. And I could go on for a long time about how that transpired, but that's really not my role here. So I'll try to give you the brief synopsis from what he wrote in his after action report about Antietam. They were middle of the day of the battle. It's a day-long battle, and it's a very fluid, very unpredictable battle at Antietam. And they had just come into the action, the brigade of 6th Corps that he belonged to. And they were in the neighborhood of what was called the Piper Farm, which is in the center of the battlefield. I couldn't find a really good map to illustrate because the maps are very, very complicated to read because they're for military historians, not everyone else. But Hyde's regiment was stationed near this Piper Farm, and a Union gun battery, artillery battery, had been put out in front of a neighboring brigade, just to their left, and was trying to keep the Confederates a few hundred yards away from organizing and attacking. In the process, some Confederate sharpshooters got into the orchard near Piper Farm and started to pick off the Union cannoneers. You can imagine that was a little irritating to the Union battery commander. So he went over to the nearest brigade commander and started to say something about, hey, can you support us? Well, Hyde's brigade commander happened to be right nearby and said, oh, sure, I'll take care of that for you. Because it was somehow everyone seemed to think that it was great to be the guy who, offered up his troops to do the job rather than waiting for someone else to do it, volunteering your own. So he rode over to Hyde. Now you have to understand, we talk about regiments, that's supposed to be 1,000 men in theory. By this point of the war, the 7th Maine was down to fewer than 200. Okay, not all battle deaths exactly, but sick, wounded, missing, a number of reasons. They're down to under 200 men that day. So this brigade commander, who was a colonel, rode over to Hyde, who was a major at the time. So the colonel outranks him and says, Major, take your regiment up to that orchard and clear out those enemy forces. And Hyde looked at him and said, well, gee, sir, I think that I counted a rather large force move into there. I counted like 4 or 5 flags, suggesting he's outnumbered by at least 4 to 1. If the Confederate regiments are only his size, they might have been quite a bit bigger. And the colonel, who, according to some reports, is drunk at the time. That's a common charge to levy after the fact, because you want to make sure, he was drunk at the time. Might have been, might not have been, hard to say. At any rate, Hyde looks at him and says, gee, I really don't think we should go up there, which is a polite way of saying you and your horse, or the horse that you rode over on here, sir. But then Colonel Irwin said, well, are you afraid to go? Again, it's a different time. These gentlemen don't allow not only their honor, but their regiment's honor to be challenged like that. So Hyde looked back at him and said, well, if you give the order loud enough for everybody to hear, we'll go. Trying to call the colonel's bluff, partly. The colonel wasn't going to be called on that. So he gave the order really loud. So the 7th Maine, 122 guys or so, fixed their bayonets and started to march out to a target several hundred yards away through open ground. No tree cover, no, fences to hide behind, anything like that, just in the open field. So they started their march across, and the Confederates looked out at them with some level of awe, I'm sure, and thought, okay, well, we'll see what happens here. They get about halfway across the distance, form themselves into a line, of line of battle. So 100 feet across, 50 men abreast in 2 ranks. Not a great big target, but still, they were the only target out there. So the Confederate sharpshooters changed targets, of course, and then the Confederate artillery that was at the Piper Farm said, well, okay, fine, you've given us something to shoot at, here we go. There's a lot of detail in Hyde's report. They made it into the orchard and actually drove a couple of Confederate regiments back before they were finally compelled, almost surrounded, because the Confederates could maneuver, to start withdrawing after taking a substantial number of casualties. The brigade, the rest of the Union brigade turned to their officer and said, sir, we should go forward. No, the other Union officer, it was the brigade from Vermont, said, no, that place is too dangerous. You're never going to see that regiment again. So we're going to stay right where we are. Suffice to say that Hyde made it back with the survivors of the regiment, probably 40 guys that were not wounded. The rest were wounded, and all of the officers that he had in the regiment were wounded or dead. And there were 16 people missing by the time he got back to the lines. So, a brief note on the Medal of Honor at this period. It's really the only decoration the Army had at the time. We didn't have the Bronze Star and the Silver Star and all the rainbow of things that we have now. They had the Purple Heart and the Medal of Honor. So Medal of Honors were the only awards, so they got given out like penny candy sometimes. In fact, one main regiment, everybody in the regiment gets one because of a paper handling mistake, and that's only sorted out way after the war, but that's a different story. So, but he gets his in 1891. And this is actually one of the ones that's probably really, well, they were maybe all deserved, but this one was really researched and people went through the records and read everybody's reports, and a real congressional commission was involved. And so his Medal of Honor is probably more deserved than some of the others that were handed out during the Civil War. All right, let's go on to the next guy. Go back a step. All right, so this is John H. Raymond, a sergeant in A Company, the 3rd Maine Volunteers. And that, by the way, are the Bath City Grays, or at least A Company, and part of D Company with the Bath City Grays, which was our militia company prior to the war. And when the war was, when Lincoln called for his first volunteers in 1861, the City Grays were like, hey, here we are. And so they became the A Company of the 3rd Maine, and some of the officers in D Company. And they went off to war starting with Bull Run in 1861, and they went everywhere. And Sergeant Raymond, well, he started out as a private, worked his way up to sergeant, was at a whole list of battles that I could run off. But suffice to say, he was up with the Union Army from 1861 to 1864 or 1863, and missed out on Gettysburg. Well, that's maybe not a bad one to miss out on. Of course, it's the most famous battle in the war, but that's okay. We'll talk in a second about him, about why he missed that little battle, because he was at the battle before that, Chancellorsville. Now, I have an excerpt here from the article on the previous slide, which did not come out the way it was supposed to, but that's okay. So I called this a rough day. When we get down on the bottom of this, you'll understand it was more than just a rough day. So seriously wounded in the midnight charge of the Battle of Chancellorsville on the 2nd of May, 1863, in the right arm and shoulder, and retiring from the field was knocked down insensible by a tree falling on him. I'll come back to that in a second. He was carried off, or another soldier carried Mr. Raymond into an open field. Faint from the loss of blood, he fell asleep. On Sunday morning, May 3rd, was awakened by a shell exploding overhead, which broke his left leg. Left on the battlefield without food, Mr. Raymond crawled to a stream to keep his wounds wet and was picked up on the 13th of May, 10 days later. Having been on the battlefield for up to 13 days without food or having his wounds dressed, subsisting on the bark of trees and grass, was again paroled, I'll talk about that in a second, and brought into our lines under flag of truce to Potomac Creek Hospital, and as soon as he gained strength, was brought home. So he's on the battlefield for 10 days. So let me talk a little bit more, a couple of the details. If you look at the slide, there's a blue bar there labeled sickles and a blue arrow going towards the center of the map. Chancellorsville, for those who don't know, a quick synopsis, is the battle right before Gettysburg. It's fought in the same area. They're going to fight here again in 1864. They're going to call it the Wilderness at that time, because it's a very thickly, heavily wooded part of Virginia. It's cut with very deep streams. It looks a lot like our woods. If you walk out into any of the woods around here, you find these big, deep gullies, little streams at the bottom, really thick woods everywhere. That's what they're in. And they're trying to fight in this. And so this particular battle, Stonewall Jackson makes this, as shown on the map, this really wide flanking maneuver, turns the flank of the Union Army, and Dan Sickles' corps, a gentleman from New York, where the 3rd Maine happens to be in, is stationed to the south. And early in the day, he's made an attack and found nobody. So he's all, oh, we're just on top of the world here. And realizes that there's stuff going on behind him. And in this thick vegetation, a lot of the firing and fighting couldn't be heard until they got very close to one another. They call it acoustical shadows in military parlance. That's a whole different discussion. So Sickles, as it got dark, decided that he was seeing retreating soldiers coming from his rear, and he was received through various officers in order to, you got to come back this way and help stem this disaster that's developing. So they send, literally at midnight, all the reports from the various officers say around midnight, we got the order from General Sickles to charge into this position. It was apparently a full moon, so it was fairly bright even for midnight in Virginia in May. But you can imagine that trying to fight, you guys are in dark blue uniforms in the Union, the Confederates are in all sorts of colors of gray and brown and everything else. And it, we're not the advantages of all the night vision technology our soldiers have today. You're just walking around in the woods blindly with musket smoke hanging around everywhere, little fires burning from artillery. And so they had to go basically downhill. The position they were in when they started was very near where a bunch of federal artillery was in a clearing on top of the hill, firing where they thought the enemy was, because they couldn't see because of the trees. It's so heavily forested. And one of the things that you read when you read about Chancellorsville is the guys all coming out of the woods and picking these wood splinters out of their wool uniforms. They're just peppered in them because when the artillery rounds burst in the trees, what you have is all sorts of limbs and or trees falling down. Oh wait, was knocked down insensible by a tree falling on him. So the 3rd Maine goes forward at night, unknown to them. That other blue unit there, Slocum, that's the Union 12th Corps. They had gone forward as well and were already engaged with the Confederates. Well, there's a military saying that friendly fire isn't. Well, there were some friendly fire incidents here, and the 3rd Maine got stuck in one of them. And it was quite likely that the 12th Corps was thinking they were shooting at Confederates when they were shooting in the backs of the 3rd Maine instead. So any one of the wounds that Sergeant Raymond suffered could have been from friendly fire. Unfortunately, there's no really way to know. So then this battle stops on about the 6th of May, and then both sides separate to sort themselves out, lick their wounds, as it were. And he's just lying out there in the middle of the field for 10 days, waiting for someone to go, oh, hey, look. And in the meantime, he's actually captured by the Confederates. There's a term here, he's given his parole. Nobody really wanted to manage prisoners too hard, way too complicated. So what we do is we capture you on the battlefield. We say, okay, so the deal is we're gonna call you a prisoner, but we're gonna leave you here. You can't go back to Union lines and pick up a musket again until we get a Confederate back in exchange. You promise? Okay, so that's how that system works. So, but he's out there, and so eventually a Union patrol comes along under a flag of truce and says, oh, look, he's not dead. Let's take him back. So he gets paroled in exchange, complicated system, but in any case, he ends up back in the hospital. And when he goes, he's brought home. He goes back home to Maine, so he misses out on Gettysburg, and he ends the war as a staff officer in the Adjutant General's office up in Augusta. So he gets the next 2 years off with basically wearing a uniform and pushing papers. And then actually as a paper pusher, it becomes another paper pusher for the rest of Bath as the town clerk. We want to go back one slide. And so we found a signature here of John H. Raymond. And he is one of the Bath clerks for quite a while. And he actually has a rather interesting relative as well. I'm going to hand the microphone back to Joe and he can talk about that.
I represented John Raymond with a signature because there's not been an image that's been found of him. And when we get to Anthony Coombs Raymond, his father, who was the designer and builder of the Winter Street Church, there's not been an image found of him either. And Raymond Court, which is on the Center Street Hill, is named after Anthony Coombs Raymond and that family. And among other things around Bath is some of the Greek Revival homes in their attic areas have a arched window, and it's in our logo, and it's in the part of the Historical Society window logo, and that's quite unique to the city of Bath and this area, because Anthony Coombs Raymond built homes and buildings and churches throughout the area. And it wasn't the only, Winter Street Church wasn't the only church that he built in Bath. In 1838, he built the Universalist Church, which is down on Front Street, and it was torn down to build the church block, which is where the Bath Printers is today. And Anthony is buried up in Brunswick. Here we've got Major Thomas Howard, and he lived to be 102 years old. His house was on Howard Street and was used as the old couple's home until 1917, when the old folks home opened, and we call the old folks home now the Plant Memorial Home. So, and the Howard Mansion was torn down in 1931. He belonged to the Winter Street Church and was known as the godfather of the tower and spire, as because he was the one that paid for everything above the, where the above the roof line. He paid for all of that. And I used that modern picture because I just thought it was too pretty too nice to go. And here is an image of Thomas Howard and his mansion. And he was a shipbuilder, among other things. So now we go to Hallett's drugstore. And mostly it's about the clock and the drugstore look itself. Hallett's drugstore was established in 1882 on Center Street by Andrews Hallett. Fred Cox went to work for him right out of high school, and then went to Massachusetts College of Pharmacy. And they worked there. He worked there for they both worked together for quite a while. Then while Fred Cox was at school, Isaac Harris went to work for Hallett's. And Andrews Hallett sold out to Fred Cox and Harris in 1892. And then Fred Cox bought Harris out in 1897. And by that time, not by that time, but anyhow, over on the left is the stone that marks, the marker that marks Fred Cox. Andrews Hallett, there's no stones. And I'm quite sure that I was looking in the right place. And that's not unusual for many of the lots out at Oak Grove Cemetery that aren't marked with stones. And even on one of my family lots, there are people, family buried there that aren't marked. And on the right here, we have the interior workings of the Hallett's clock that is on the down street as today. So on the left, I'm thinking that it might be Fred Cox and Mr. Harris. And that is in the that's at the storefront of 70 Front Street, which is where Island Treasures toy store is today. And the top right is a early view of the clock back in the 60s when Hallett's drugstore was still at that location. And this is the interior of the Hallett's drugstore until 1966. This from 1913 to 1966 that the drugstore looked like this. And I just am so I just love that. I just love that shot. It's just like I just can't get over it.
My name is Andrew. I work at CBS Pharmacy now and that. I'm a grandson and one of the original people in the house. This started in the house in 1901. This is the drug sign, the wedded glass drug sign, it's stored over Hallett's drugstore on Front Street in Bath from 1913 to 1966. There was so much involved in their describing, so to speak. They weren't really describing, but they were treating people that came on the street. They were in mixed concoctions, which down to the again, trying to help people out. And a lot of pharmacy is drawn by the wayside of this house. The old pharmacist has spent 90% of the time performing one prescription, so 90% of the time getting the close out of the body. Most of the items in the pharmacy were 25, 50 cents a dollar. I've got a bunch of books in the garage for prescriptions. There is a place like 12 prescriptions on the page. And see the doctors that were years ago. Nothing was original. There are a couple of old prescriptions. This is a set of powders that were produced at Hallett's Pharmacy and Sagatart Block. And those 12 powders with 3 different ingredients. 12 powders sold for 40 cents. And then there was a note at the bottom of the prescription saying that if the prescription is doubled, it would be 75 cents. This was another formula here that I found in the book. The powder is post-conditioned powder, and it was a quarter pound each of fenugreek, sulfur, alcompane, black antimony, saltpeter, saleratus, and ginger. And then is that true?
Now, getting back to Hallett's drugstore, it left 70 Front Street, went to 66 Front Street, which is where House of Logan is, and the Newberry's department store had vacated the space. And I'm not sure exactly when Hallett's closed down. And back when Hallett's left 66 Front Street, Harry Crooker bought the clock, and there was an outrage within the citizens of the city of Bath. And Harry graciously signed it over to the city if the city maintained it and kept it running. And if it did not, if that did not happen, then it would go back to the family, which is Thomas Point Beach. Most of what I'm gonna say about Emma Ames is written right on the screen here. And this is the Church of the New Jerusalem, which is on the corner of Winter and Middle Street. It still exists today and is still an operating church. And the image of young Emma as a young girl was when she was at age 16. And a parishioner at the church heard her sing as a young girl, encouraged her to take voice lessons. And at the age of 24 in 1889, this is when her opera career really took off. When she retired, I think that was in 1916, she bought the house at 7 North Street. And this is her in her garden at North Street.
Bath produced a internationally famous opera singer. She was very active in 1897. Her name was Emma Ames. She grew up in Bath. She graduated from Bath High School, sang as a youngster here in Bath. There was something very special about her voice. She sang at the Met. She even sang in a command performance at Windsor Castle one day in Romeo and Juliet. She was probably most famous for her role in Juliet. Very few people in Bath ever heard her sing, because she didn't sing when she came back here for the most part. Everybody, however, knew her name because the Times wrote about her a lot. Later, she returned to Bath and lived on North Street, right next door to the publisher of the Times. When she died, she got one of the largest gravestones in Oak Grove Cemetery. Bath.
The marker took nearly a year to complete. It's of Carrara marble. A carved replica of a book plate. The tree clinging through storm and stress to the rock-bound coast. The book plate was made by Pittsburgh's own nationally renowned artist, Ernest Haskell. Here we have Benjamin Morse, and this is truly a remarkable marker for sure. And this is more about the marker than him. I'm having a brain cramp here. Benjamin Morse was head of the firm of BW and HF Morse, and was largely interested in owning and sailing the largest number of three-masted schooners, and also played a major piece of harvesting Kennebec and selling Kennebec River ice. At one time, he owned the largest tugboat in the world. The tree is a replica oak tree weighing approximately 18 to 20 tons and was carved by William Liberty. And to replicate the look of the bark and the broken branches, in excess of 20 feet in height and 3 feet in diameter at the top, granite for the monument was sourced in Hollowell. And these images that I show you are old images. And that's why the stones look so clean and nice, because they are the old, you know, back then, all the stuff wasn't growing on them like it is today. William Liberty arrived in Bath in 1887 and opened Liberty Marble Works. And in 1891, they went into association with William Lake. And we probably think that he carved the children's monument for John Ramsey's children.
People must have had a lot of money that they had saved for memorialization. I mean, now, that looks like a dead tree. And then look at the mausoleum next to it. It represented what the people must have had a lot of. Is that something? Does that look like a plaque to the vaults? That's not a plaque. That's what was left. They cut it all off. That at one time was way over here. They cut this all off. We got that scroll in there. And then somebody by hand polished those letters. Everything was done by hand. Everything. The different round raised letters, square raised letters. All of these, all done by hand. Little intricate things, all done by hand. And a mallet. I've got a mallet that shows you probably over millions of times that it's been down. You have to be very, very careful with this. But you don't need any equipment to do this work. You don't need any equipment at all. What you need is just pair of eyes and well, this is all my grandfather. This is his only tool that he had. And that's probably been hit hundreds of thousands of times. This is, I was saying that, you know, how close I work to this thing here. But if you get on this side here, you come down and whoa, you know, you hit that knuckle. And you only hit it once or twice a day. Back in my grandfather's day was bull luck and pig. They were masters at rolling stones and rolling stones to the lawn.
And this is John Pate. This is what a monument seller would memorialize his lot with. Here we have Constable Uncle Billy Lawrence. Shortly after midnight on September 4th, 1883, Uncle Billy Lawrence surprised Daniel Wilkinson on Broad Street, which is on the corner of the Bath Savings Front Street and where Bath Savings Institution is today. And Wilkinson was attempting to do a burglary and shot Uncle Billy and killed him. Wilkinson went to Thorne's Head and stole a rowboat and rowed across the river, and they found him up in Bangor a week later. When they went to hang him, the hanging didn't happen quite as the way that it was supposed to, and it ended the death penalty for the state of Maine. And it took 2 years later for the state to hang him. Sergeant Merle Niles was another police officer that was shot while on duty. And as you can see, this was quite a bit later in the 1960s. And then I was thinking that, also Ed Newell got shot somehow, but I'm not sure whether he was, what, department he was with, but, I didn't think about him until this morning. So the latest and newest section of the Oak Grove Cemetery is the Beth Israel Cemetery. Jewish tradition has it that they are buried just as quickly as they can get them into the ground. And there wasn't a Jewish cemetery in the area. Everybody went to Portland. And it was, I believe, Dawn's wife and maybe Dawn also, you know, started a movement to buy some land or to get some land in the cemetery so that the Jewish families from Bath could be buried here. And Dawn died in 2001 and was buried in Portland. But he was removed from Portland and brought to Bath in 2003, which is when the cemetery, which that section of the cemetery was dedicated. And the cemetery department tries to keep that road open so that they can do the winter burials if needed. Here we see Dawn on the left, Tendon store, and in the center is Povich's Men's Store at 143 Front Street, which is Bath Group Company and Bath Group Pub. And his father Morris is over here on the right. So right here we have Jimmy Stofan, and if you walk through the archway, let me get my notes. Jimmy Stofan for 28 years was a graphic designer and commercial marine illustrator at the Ironworks. While studied at the Portland School of Fine and Applied Arts, which is now the main College of Art. As part of the Ironworks Community Service Program, he designed the gateway signs now in the archway. In the 70s, he worked closely with the City of Bath and Sagahawk Preservation on the downtown restoration. He also designed and helped build the gazebo in the park, which is outside our doors here. So here we talk about, we have the Cahill family here, most of them anyway. And in 1938, Charlie Cahill wanted to sell gas. And so he put up his filling station there, which is still there today. And up on the top left is Charlie's grandson, David, which is Skip's son, and Skip is on the right. Charlie's in the middle. And who I don't have represented is Skip's daughter, Marlene. It's David and Marlene are the ones that run the station today. And when Skip, who's Charles III, went to work at the station, he developed the tire selling part of the business. When you went to Charlie, you know, he was the one that pumped the gas, and you didn't just get gas, you got a story. He always told a story. It was a wonderful man. One of the customers came in and wanted to do took some photographs of him and created this watercolor of him. He's been my next door neighbor, and I've known the family for generations. My family's known their family for generations. We couldn't, we were running out of time and we really couldn't, honor Priscilla and John Pat Montgomery as well as, I would have liked to have done, but, Pat Montgomery came to Bath to work in the ironworks in the drawing, he was the manager of the drawing room. And that was in 1964. And they bought a house across the street from the Morse High School #2. And proceeded for the next 30 years to run the drama and theater department of the school as a team. She directed all the plays and he was the tech person. He designed the sets, built the sets, did all the lighting and all the technical stuff. They were quite a team. She died in 1996, 1994, and I think it was 1994. And that's their monument marker on the left there. So here we come to Galen Moses. And it wasn't until I had initially started to focus on Oliver Moses. But then I was doing some research yesterday and realized that it was Galen Moses and I believe his brother who were really the two men that were instrumental in founding Saginaw Real Estate Association. And they were the sons of Oliver Moses. And just to go back a little bit, the archway that we talked about earlier was installed basically because Oliver Moses had a foundry on Water Street, which ended up being the Bath Iron Foundry, and they had a store on Front Street that sold the stove. So to get back and forth, they created that archway. And it was at Oliver Moses' death, I believe, when Saginaw Real Estate Association was founded, and that was in 1887. So back in the 1960s, this man on the right, John Morse, and they called him Junior, but I think he was like number 3, but they really called him Junior. And he bought the controlling interest of like 50%, 51% of the stock, and started to operate Saginaw Real Estate. And as you can see from the Sanborn maps here, some of the buildings that were owned by the Saginaw Real Estate with the green dots, and then there were 4 others that are off the map. And then there's probably another one down by the A&P store, which is where Brackets is today, that I didn't include because I wasn't sure. So, but there were a total of more than 20 stores. And they had stores, they had a couple of buildings on Elm Street also. I didn't mention that already. And one on Water Street. It was at old Mr. Morse's death that his daughter Jane came to back home to Bath from Boston to run the business. And Saginaw Real Estate was more than just owning the building. There was a lot more than that. The family cared about Bath, the shop owners in the buildings. Under Jane's management, she tried to have stores that were good for Bath. As John IV said in a June talk here, It was a community pride and partnership for over 100 years. And just a few years ago, the last of the Saginaw real estate holdings were sold off to a whole new regime of building owners, and most of them, or some of them were, John gave preference to the shop owners. If they wanted to buy the buildings, he made that happen. And then other people bought some of, bought a bunch of them. And so here we have Ralph Lagarde. He was the first taxi man in Bath. And up in the upper left-hand corner, you see a 1912 International truck that he outfitted with seats. And that's at the old train station, which is where the new train station is today. And I can't remember much about Ralph, because when I put this together, it was like, and when I finished putting this together, it was like early this morning, and I was getting tired, so. And Ralph had to sign a contract with the Maine Central Railroad, which gave him exclusive rights to transport the train passengers around. And here's a view of the old train station. So I came across the obituary of Mr. Charles Skinner. And really, it started with looking for his son, who was Harry Skinner. And Harry Skinner grew up in, owned the house beside my mother until 1956. So it was all through my mother's growing up years and young adult years that Mr. Harry Skinner lived next door. And then I started looking at Mr. Charles Skinner, and his obituary was quite interesting. And I'm not sure for sure, but I would say that Mr. Charles Skinner, was born enslaved. And as you can see by the text on the screen, Reverend Benjamin Bronson, who had been in Bath or came to Bath at a Baptist church, I guess rescued or took in Charles Skinner, and then Mr. Charles Skinner lived the rest of his life in Bath. And but like I said, I'm not for sure that he was an enslaved person, but it kind of looks it to me. So here we have, we're getting pretty close to the end. I believe that Mr. Barrett Nichols might be the longest lived person in the Oak Grove Cemetery. He lived to be 108 years old. He was born in 1910 and died 108 years later. His father, Frank Nichols, ran the Bath Daily Times, which is on Front Street across from where today Rennie's is, and they published the Bath Daily Times and the Bath Independent, which was a weekly.
It's fond of telling people it was very close to what Mr. Gutenberg was doing in the 1500s. There were really two major changes that had happened in all of that time. And one of them was in the 1880s when Mr. Otto Bergenthaler invented a linotype machine. That was a dramatic, you could suddenly, by using a keyboard, you could generate text. Now, it couldn't be used for large headlines or anything, it could just be used for the body of the story. But that was a major step forward. I'm Cam Niven, publisher of the Times Record in Brunswick. I am the third generation of a newspaper family. Frank Nichols bought the Bath Daily Times in 1897. He's been hired from a paper that he was working on in Rockland as a part owner of it. And he came to work for John Patton in 1895. He just barely made things go and eventually blessed the big.
Frank Nichols also owned the Brunswick Record. And eventually the two of them merged. So we have, as today, we have the Bath Brunswick Times Record. And here we have Charlie Bird, who's been a very huge credit to rescuing and saving bits and pieces of the history of the city of Bath. I didn't really come out as a town historian until much later in my life and did not know Charlie. And I was down to the Maritime Museum recently, and there were a lot of his stuff on display. And when I was there, it was bittersweet because I really wished that I had had more time to talk to him about the excursions that he had to collect all the stuff that he collected. So this is why Charlie's there. And he has the last laugh. The two on the left are in Oak Grove Cemetery. The one on the right is on Oak Grove Cemetery, but I thought it was too priceless to not include it. So I didn't do all this myself. I had all these people help me, but I will say that I don't use a computer. So everything was done by hand, and because of my knowledge of stuff around in all the institutions, I was able to amass all of this. And Tim was able to get it in order. And if it wasn't for these people, we wouldn't be standing here today. And I thank you very much.